My name is Charlene Zietsma. I'm from PennState University. I'm a dual Canadian-U.S. citizen, but grew up and spent most of my life in Canada, so I'm just a recent American. And my research agenda is focused on social change. So I study social change from a whole variety of different perspectives, and as that is my objective, I will use whatever tools I can from different theories or contexts in order to study it. So that puts me at the intersection of organization theory and entrepreneurship, and I use literature from both areas. I also use social movement theory and other theories, but institutional theory is probably my dominant home. I study different ways in which people make institutional change. Usually social change has an institutional focus, and so that includes looking at conventional entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs and change agents in a variety of contexts. It includes often looking at the field level, sometimes at the societal level, and sometimes at individual organizations and the kinds of change that they're making. But typically I'm looking at changes that people are making in order to make the world more sustainable or socially just in some way. I got interested in working in contexts of poverty as one of these big issues requiring social change, and looking at market-based approaches to do that. Published a paper with Kevin McCaig and Christine Oliver in 2015 looking at creating the social structure for a market in Bangladesh in order to use market-based interventions. And so got really interested in that project, but actually I didn't do any of the field work. Kevin and Christine were in Bangladesh and did all the field work, and so I thought, well, it'd be nice to do some field work. And then I was working with Day Day, which is the organization that's been involved in Sri Lanka in introducing these changes. And we were looking at the way they were intervening in multiple countries in order to increase the number of financial cooperatives in many countries as a means of empowering local actors and allowing them to help themselves. And they came up with this project in Sri Lanka, and we thought, wow, this sounds terrific. And of course, Angelique Slade-Shantz, who's the first author on the piece I'm presenting today, is my former Ph.D. student. She's now assistant professor at the University of Alberta, and her dissertation was focused on innovative entrepreneurship in contexts of poverty. So this fit perfectly well with her. When the opportunity came up to work in Sri Lanka, we took the field experiment methodology that she'd been using elsewhere and applied it there, looked at how do we induce innovation, and for me it was a wonderful chance to actually participate in the field work in a developing country and see the effects of what was going on. It was wonderful research to do, actually, because lots of struggle to create the interventions and see how they might work. We had to work really hard with local people in order to make sure that they fit the context really well. And then we rolled them out, and after we did the field experiment, we trained 700 different micro-entrepreneurs, or almost 700, in two conditions, and one condition was focused on the more traditional way that people teach entrepreneurship, which is saying, hey, here are these successful people, you can be like them too, here's the way you do it, not like you're doing right now. Follow the steps that these successful people are doing. So that's kind of an aspirational frame, and it's a frame shifting approach because it's saying, don't do what you're doing right now, do something else. We compared that to a frame bridging approach, which instead takes something that they already know and that they feel is attainable for them and says, we want you to do something just like you always do, but in this new context. So we talked about how they were innovative at home, innovative in their domestic life, with their children, with their gardens, with their cooking, all kinds of things like that, and said, you can do that in business too. And we tested those two interventions to see which one would be more effective. It was interesting because when we explained the two conditions to the trainers in Sri Lanka, they said, that bridging condition, that domestic thing, that is not going to work. That is so stupid. How can people do that? People won't get the connection between the domestic life and entrepreneurship. But in fact, that condition worked better. And people took a lot more joy in what they were doing. It changed the attractiveness of innovating for them because they could see, hey, I'm confident. I do this all the time elsewhere. I can just do this here too. And so at the end of the study, a couple of us went back and interviewed many of the micro entrepreneurs and asked them, you know, what was going on, what did they do in their business. And it was just so interesting to see all of the changes that they made in a very short period of time. They really had a lot of innovative capacity. Just a little subtle shift in reframing, and they were able to unleash all this innovative capacity and do some really neat things. And the trainers were convinced afterwards too, so that was good. So in my mind, those are three different, right? The quiet, under the radar kind of change, the collaborative kind of change, and the highly conflictual kind of change. So it all fits into my strategy of figuring out social change by surrounding it and checking out every which way to do it. The conflictual one, that was my dissertation work. That was, I remember watching it on the news before I ever started studying it, and seeing the CEOs from the forest companies on the news really saying, these environmentalists are basically crazy people, they don't know what they're talking about. They really could not understand the environmental perspective, and they felt that they were doing the right thing. And in the interviews as well, it became very clear that they felt that they were doing things in a scientifically valid way, in an economically valid way, and they felt that the critique was just wrong. There were very few connections across, and things started to change when they started to build relationships across, and that relational aspect really made a big difference. So for me, they could not understand each other. Once you build the bridge, they start to understand each other a little bit more and can start to value the other's perspective even if they don't buy it, right? At least if they value it, that you can get a conversation going. In the Psychiatry Club study, this is more about a group of people who really had no access to political or economic decision makers. As women, they were kind of shut out of that domain. But that meant also they had their own place in society that was valid, and they could do whatever they wanted in that place because those economic and political decision makers weren't paying attention to them. So they were able to create their own sets of practices and organizations and as ways of doing things under the radar without any direct challenge to the status quo. And as a result, they had, lots of experiments, lots of really interesting things happening. With the collaborative change, the industry actually kind of drove this change, and they drove it because they saw that there was the potential. So they saw a threat, they saw the potential for their industry to be really hurt by these voices in the environment that were kind of disconnected, but were saying we have to pay more attention to sustainability and tourism. And they thought, hey, before these guys get really organized and they influence the government to regulate us, we need to start talking to them and figure out a way out of this problem. And so theoretically, the movement itself, the sustainable tourism movement in that context was in a permeable position, we say. Their boundaries were very permeable, they were pretty disorganized, and so the industry connected with them thinking they would co-opt them. Interestingly, they ended up co-opting each other. So they built relationships together, government was involved again, they had all sorts of field configuring events, and in that process, they were hugging and kissing each other when they met, and they were built these strong relationships, saw each other's perspectives, and they built a set of practices that allowed collaboration and allowed sustainability to get into the Dutch tourism model. So you're asking what differentiates among them? The frame, if the frame or the mindset or the perspective or the logic, different ways different people call it, if they can't understand each other, you're going to get conflict. If they build relationships, that conflict is eased and that you can get collaboration. If they don't have any access, they're going to go under the radar, and as long as they stay under the radar, they're probably safe. With the Saikatsu Club, their under the radar strategy still created spillovers, I think, because it allowed people to see a different way of operating and then start to demand that elsewhere as well. To me, it's really interesting because experimental spaces or free spaces are areas where institutional controls are loosened, so people don't have to follow the rules because they're tightly bounded. This is meant to be low stakes, it's not meant to be permanent, it's not often publicly communicated, so frequently you can do things in that space that you're not held to elsewhere, and so you can try different things, and that trial allows you to see whether you can come to some agreement, whether you can negotiate things, and identify the means of working out the details. So yeah, absolutely critical in the forest industry, where the First Nations and the environmentalists and the companies got together, kind of forced to get together actually by some of their constituencies, but in doing so they were able to work out the details. They also formed relationships, which made it easier. In the Saikatsu Club, it was distributed experimentation across many different places, and that allowed them to try different options, and the best one would actually get selected into the organization as a whole. So I think experiments are a really critical way for institutional settings to adapt. Well, let me talk about a study I've got going on right now as well. We studied the Ford Foundation and their attempt to bring human rights institutions into China, and of course, they can't do it directly. They have to work with local actors. So they ended up working with sub-elite actors, people who were connected to the elites, but not in political positions and rulemaking positions themselves. And they were able to launch a ton of experiments that incorporated human rights values into different ways of operating. And we think that the Chinese government actually allowed those experiments to happen because it was low stakes for them. They didn't have to look like they were doing it themselves, so they didn't have to look like they were saying this is a good thing. But they could see what happened, how they worked. So experiments have that great character of allowing you to test things without huge expectations. The depressing answer is they should go somewhere else, right? That's the easy and the depressing answer. But we actually published a paper in JBV that looked at the entrepreneur's side of this paper. And so did a qualitative comparative analysis of the different pathways that they took in order to legitimate their businesses. And the ones that were in the toughest position, so they were highly dependent on incumbent actors in order to access the market, they succeeded when they used a consistency discourse. So they said, yeah, we're just like you, we're just going to help you out a little bit in this area, but we work perfectly well with you and you're great. And when it wasn't a radical change, or it wasn't positioned as a radical change, and when they had external sources of legitimacy. So either they had entrepreneurs who had been serial entrepreneurs, so they had a success rate from before. Most of them did much better if they had international operations. So in some ways that was because of the legitimacy that was conferred by that, but also because the international operations helped them support the Canadian operations. But those pathways, we focused that paper on optimal distinctiveness and the idea of, where's the legitimacy threshold? And the idea was you had to differentiate your business once you got over the legitimacy threshold, but the legitimacy threshold varied depending on the conditions that you found yourself in. So how dependent you were on incumbents was a key factor influencing that threshold. So I'm going to give you a feminist answer. I think that until we got a critical mass of women in the field, that researchers probably didn't tend to pay much attention to emotions, that it's less legitimate or less obvious, less out there for male researchers. So if you look back in a lot of the institutional studies, there's emotions all over the place, right? You could see them there. But until it's okay to talk about emotions as a researcher, then it's difficult to actually go there. And I think with a critical mass of women researchers out there as well, more people being able to stand up and say, yeah, emotions are a real thing and they actually really impact decision making, then you start to get researchers doing it. Now, I'm not saying that researching emotions is gendered, because if you look, there are a lot of male and female emotions researchers, but I think the environment had to change enough where it was a legitimate thing to talk about. I think emotions permeate every institutional change process. So we have a paper right now that's conditionally accepted at AMJ. Hopefully any day now we'll hear it's accepted. And we're looking at how a social movement, an anti-plastic pollution movement, used visual images to stimulate people's moral outrage, shock, get them really emotionally intense, and then transformed those emotions into emotional energy in order to enact a cause. So they got them, really negatively emotionally charged, and then blamed themselves for creating the problem, and then said, but it's okay because we're working with you and we know how to change this. And so solidarity messages and hope messages, and we're all in this together. And so through that they transformed them into adherence to the cause, so that they would try to live the plastic-free life as much as possible. So that's one of the projects that I have ongoing. But in the China study as well, we can see how emotions are the relational connection is part of the way some of those human rights institutions transfer over to the sub-elite actors, so they can start to use those institutions in their own context. And I see it in multiple other projects. To me, over the last few years, a lot of the projects that I've done have had emotions as the focus. Going forward, I think there will be a lot more studies that have emotions as one of the things that are part of the change process. That it's just, we'll start to take it for granted as a natural thing to study, as opposed to something that, hey, we've never studied this before, we have to focus on it. So, of course, the most exciting thing is collecting the data. Yeah, it's always fun to talk to people with different perspectives and to really engage and find out the detail. And I love playing with the data and getting to see how things happen. It's, of course, challenging, and I think anybody who does qualitative research understands the challenges of the projects take a lot longer. Frequently you're studying processes or you're studying things over time, takes a lot longer. The deep engagement with theorizing takes a lot longer. The writing process, sometimes you're changing it so many times, your theoretical framing each time, so that takes longer. And in a world where people just count A publications, that's tough, right? It's tough. Yeah, I probably wouldn't have it any other way. I think for a lot of the things that I want to study, it's difficult to study them in a quantitative way, and so that deep engagement in what's going on is really critical. I think it makes qualitative researchers more well-rounded people. It helps in the classroom because you have good examples to share with students, and it really helps to build you. It's a process that takes time, though. The first thing is probably study what you're passionate about, because it takes time and engagement, and if you're not passionate about something, then you can lose that energy for completing projects really quickly. When I was doing my Ph.D., my husband used to say to me, "You're a sprinter trying to run a marathon." And I've become a marathon runner in the meantime. Not really, but metaphorically. I think that having that orientation to the long run and engaging in a project really deeply takes that passion. So that'd be my number one piece of advice. My number two piece of advice is about writing, actually. Writing is so critical in qualitative research, but it's also critical in quantitative research. The clearer you can get in your writing, the more structured, the more you can make it easy for your reader to follow what you're trying to say, the faster your process of publication. It's one skill area that a lot of doctoral programs don't teach, but it's probably one of the things that will actually jumpstart your career quite a bit, just because it'll smooth that path to publication. There's an AMJ article by Locke and Golden-Biddle, Karen Locke and Karen Golden-Biddle, that talks about constructing contribution. And again, it looks at qualitative research, so it goes back and analyzes qualitative studies published in AMJ, and it looks at the way in which people construct their contribution for their audiences, and it does such a great job. It's equally applicable to quantitative research, I think, but I would advise any PhD student to read that as a first step in trying to understand how we actually write these things up. I wish I'd read it in my PhD program. I would have done a lot better earlier on.